As you might expect with some Leyland produced Brummie enthusiast cars, the reliability and build quality wasn't exactly Japanese, let's put it that way. Hello and welcome to another Car Nerd story. I am Jason Hassett, the aforementioned Car Nerd, and today I'm going to talk to you about a British-European joint venture, the first fundamentally Japanese car to be assembled in Europe, and I am of course talking about the ever-famous Triumph Acclaim. Thank you very much for one of the commenters, Fraser Moo, for pointing out this car and allowing me to maybe say a bit of an apology in that British Leyland did make an incredible car, even if it was technically Japanese. If you do like these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe, but in the meantime, grab yourself a crumpet and a lovely katana and let's jump straight into this car. So in 1978, British Leyland was looking for a replacement for a few of its cars, not just one actually. So they were looking to replace the aging Triumph Dolomite, which had been around since 1971, along with the even more aging Austin Maxi and the Allegro, which had been around since the early 70s, and I believe the Allegro or the Maxi was the late 60s. So these cars were getting very, very aged. When it comes to the latter two, the Maxi and the Allegro, as you might expect with some Leyland produced Brummie enthusiast cars, the reliability and build quality wasn't exactly Japanese, let's put it that way. And if you disagree with that and you think that Brummie cars were the best cars ever damn made and I should go off back to my country where I came from because of Brexit, then put it in the comments and I'll happily disagree and tell you I'm Irish and couldn't care less. But in the meantime, we should carry on with talking about this. So the Alexa? Anyway, we'll edit that out probably. The Allegro and the Maxi suffered from massive problems with poor build quality and reliability, and this was kind of a trend during the British Leyland years. Unfortunately, things had kind of not gone to plan as Thatcher wanted, because poor old Maggie, rest her soul, was too busy fighting coal to worry about production quality of the Leyland motors. So they wanted to introduce a new car that would be a stopgap, as they knew that they couldn't replace the Maxi and the Allegro until the mid 1980s, until 83 and 84, because they were still working on the Maestro and the Montego. So they needed a stopgap to get them between those times and produce something of quality that they could continue to sell. So they looked to the Japanese, and specifically Honda, and in 1978 they began talks about whether they could take a Honda car that was existing and put it into the market in Europe. And this would be the first time this was done and bypass the 11% rule, the kind of voluntary 11% market share rule that the EU had in place at the time. So they took what was called the Honda Blade and started looking at that car and figuring out whether they could bring this successfully into Europe, and they figured they could. So on December 26, 1979, Michael Edwards, the then chief executive of British Leyland, signed an agreement with Honda to begin production of the new Triumph Acclaim, and the car would go into production a short 18 months later. This car was so successful for British Leyland, and people thought that the build quality and the reliability was so good that they decided to use Honda as a manufacturing partner for Rover cars throughout the 80s and the early 90s, before Rover kind of met its demise along with the rest of the British Leyland group. In terms of looks, this car was essentially just a Honda Blade from Japan, but spec'd up for the European market. It had a obviously boxy shape, but that was pretty normal in the 80s and the late 70s anyway. And other than that, this didn't look like a specifically Japanese car. It looks slightly more Japanese than the British cars, but with the way the headlights were designed and the way everything was designed back then, you probably wouldn't know the difference unless you were a proper car enthusiast. Two of the big differences with this car were the fact that the badge, which in Japan was normally on the right hand side of the grille, was placed on the center of the grille. Obviously in Japan they drive on the same side of the road, that is to say the wrong side of the road that I drive on in Ireland as well, but here in sunny Mexico I drive on the right side, or wrong side as Clarkson would. But anyway, this doesn't matter, so anyway, let's move on. So the other big difference was that the wing mirrors were not placed on the front fenders, which was the style at the time in Japan. They were put on the A-pillars, which is normal for Europeans, Americans, and basically everywhere else nowadays. A few other differences were made as well in terms of the interior. This was made to be much more upmarket interior wise than their Japanese counterpart, and that was one thing that European cars did have over the Japanese counterpart. Now, the Japanese were much like the Germans. In fact, their cars were very, very reliable, but the English cars at the time, much like Jaguar British sports cars, were always seen as more upmarket in terms of interior luxury. So you could get this car in the standard BL trims, which are, I've forgotten. So you could get this car in the standard British Leyland trim levels at the time, which were L, HL and HLS. But if you were a big spender of the day, or let's be honest, for someone like me, if your dad was a big spender back then, you could get the CD model, and the CD model was something else entirely. It had chrome front bumpers, front and rear electric windows, plastic covers for the wheels, which is just incredible, and most importantly it had a velour trim upholstery in the entire interior, which is pretty cool indeed. Not like that stupid leather that we have these days. Velour.
Come over here and feel my velour bedspread.
It also, if you wanted, had a front headlight washers, automatic washers on the front headlights that you could also control from the interior. So take that, Volvo. Yeah, how do you feel about that one? The engine in this car was a 4-cylinder from the Honda Civic. It was a 1335 cylinder traversely mounted engine, or not longitudinally, and if you don't know the difference you can watch this video up here, but essentially that means it's sideways instead of longitudinal, which was normal by then, to be honest. The Mini had changed all that, but just watch the video, it's not important. But this engine was slightly different because the blade had the original blade that was in the Honda Civic engine that was in the blade had just one carburetor. This one had twin K-in carburetors, and if I'm saying that wrong, I'm sorry. And it also had an interesting feature, which was they took the cast alloy rocker cover off the engine and they put a plain black pressed steel one on, just so you wouldn't know that this was a Honda engine, and you'd be pleasantly surprised at the reliability of the latest British Leyland car. In terms of performance, they also added McPherson struts to make the ride a little bit smoother, as well as adding in disc brakes to the front as opposed to rear and front drum brakes. It still maintained the drum brakes at the back, but the front was replaced with disc brakes to be more effective and more upmarket. The last thing about this engine is its performance figures, which are absolutely mind-blowing. This car could do a 0 to 60 run in 12.5 seconds and would carry on all the way to 96 miles an hour. My final word on this car is that it was killed off in the summer of 1984, the year, not the book, and it gave way to the Rover 200, and by the time 84 had come around, the Triumph name had been removed from cars and was now only on future motorbikes, and the Austin name had also reached a similar demise. In terms of sales, this car did quite well. In its short 3-year run, it sold 133,000 units, which is quite good when you consider the Dolomite, which it replaced, sold 200,000 units in 9 years, so not too bad at all. And in fact, the car did so well in terms of consumer reports that Rover decided to use Honda engines in their cars throughout the 80s and 90s to basically make them better, and they worked with Honda on the bodies and with rebranding cars and so on throughout those times as well. And in 1984 the Maestro would come in along with the Montego, the estate version, and I may do a video on that soon as well, because not only was I in a Montego for a car crash, it was also my granddad's car that he left us when he died, so that's an interesting fact about the Montego that only relates to me. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to tune in tomorrow when I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. And by tomorrow, I mean Sunday. Tomorrow is the podcast, which you can watch on this channel here. And Sunday, we'll be chatting about a how-to video, which is entitled How to Enjoy Motorsport, and is a bit more quirky and fun than these videos. Thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe. Talk to you soon.